The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
We're really lucky to have a guest lecturer, David Tames, today, who is a very talented and experienced videographer and cinematographer with a vast array of experience, everything from sort of pioneering web video through feature films and in between. Also, he's a sort of well-known tech guru who has a well-regarded blog, kinoeye.com. He's a graduate of MIT's Media Lab and currently an instructor at MassArt. And he's going to take us through some of the basics of lighting, and we're then going to do a demonstration of basic interview three-point lighting, which should be a lot of fun. So take it away, David.
Well, glad to be here. Thanks, Chris. So as Chris said, we're going to talk about basic lighting, and we're going to use a simple, straightforward interview as the subject of our lighting discussion. Today, of course, there's a lot of things that we can light, but basically, interview lighting will be our focus. Just since we're at MIT, we need to talk a little bit about what light is. It's a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes are sensitive to. As the wavelengths get shorter, you end up with things like X-rays and gamma rays. And as the wavelengths get longer, we end up with radio waves, just like this wireless mic going on here. But this tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum is what our eyes happen to be sensitive to. And this is the medium that we are working with. These are our materials that we work with in film and video. And of course, you know, there's that classic experiment that Newton did in his, I guess it was his grandmother's barn or something. Not only did it was well known at his time, you know, that light, you could break white light into the constituency of the various colors of the rainbow. But he also showed that once you broke it down to those colors, you couldn't break it down any further, and that with a second prism, you could recombine that light back into white light. So it turns out that working with any combination of red, green, and blue light, we can create any of the colors that we're sensitive to. And so interestingly enough, most of our imaging systems today basically work with red, green, and blue receptors, which we will talk about why red, green, and blue happens to be sort of the star colors from which all other colors can be derived. And it turns out that our eyes have receptors sensitive in the blue range, the green range, and the red range, and we are most sensitive to those in the green range. Perhaps our ancestors who could see green were more successful than our ancestors who were primarily sensitive to other frequencies of light. Who knows about that? But enough technical stuff. When we talk about light creatively, we're not thinking about wavelengths and the individual colors that much, but we're thinking about certain characteristics. We often talk about intensity. How bright is the light? And it turns out that since most light sources radiate in all directions, there's very, very rapid fall off of light. So we call that the inverse square law. So if you're by a window and you have a really, really nice exposure, walking away from the window just a little bit is enough to end up in darkness, because if you double the distance between the light and the subject, you only have 1/4 of the intensity as before. So you're always working against the inverse square law in terms of the intensity. So if you need your light to be brighter, you can always move it closer to your subject or get a bigger light. We also talk about the quality of light, whether it's hard or soft. Hard light has bold shadows, crisp textures. We'll look at an example in just a moment. And soft light has gentle contrast. It's more diffused, typically very soft or no shadows. We often talk about the direction of light. Where is it coming from? It refers to the path of the light from the source of the light to our subject. Is it coming from the front, the side, the back, under light, top light? And we use these terms to describe where the light comes from. And of course, color. Like we just saw in the previous slide, it's the relative mix of wavelengths. And color is often motivated by the light source. So if we want to depict a sunny day, we have sort of we use yellows and very, very light blues and white, it can establish mood. So if we're going to, typically period pieces that take places during the Renaissance happen to have sort of a kind of an orange glow about them. Just last night I saw Goya's Ghost and was reminded of how we seem to depict certain time periods with certain color palettes. Perhaps since the primary light source during the Renaissance was candles, instead of HMI daylight balanced lights like we have on film sets today, it makes a lot of sense that in the evenings the world was predominantly sort of this golden yellow.
Just want to add one quick thing about that. As a documentary filmmaker who's often working in available light, just remember that those qualities that David just talked about apply to available light just as much as to lights that you might set up. So if you think about the lighting in this room, it's really important to start getting sensitive to those exact same situations. Where's the light coming from? It's coming from overhead lights. So what does that mean for the way things look? What are the colors of those lights? Well, they're fluorescents, but if you actually look at the bulbs, you see that they don't even match from fixture to fixture.
Yeah, some of these over here are yellow, and some of
are-
these over
are
here
very
are
blue.
more towards the white
Blue,
range.
white. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that you start to become sensitive to, even as a documentary filmmaker working without lights. And all of those things, whether the harshness,
Yep.
the quality of the light, the intensity of the light, the direction, the color, are assessments that you need to make even in situations where you're not actually controlling the light with artificial light producing instruments like we're going to work with later.
Yeah. I mean, even when I go to do an interview and I'm doing sort of a pre-interview and talking to the subject, I always say, can we talk while we're walking around? Because I want to sort of look at the light in the environment and try to start with something natural.
Exactly.
I mean, just this weekend we were on Martha's Vineyard doing an interview, and we carted the lighting kit, in the trunk of the car. We carried it around. We took it across the ferry. We carried this big, huge lighting kit with us wherever we went, and I never cracked it open because we were able to find several positions to do our interviews where the lighting was perfect and natural. However, it was very important for me to know that if we didn't find a beautiful spot, we could accent what we had and supplement with additional light.
So one of the big takeaways from this lecture today isn't just how to set up lights, although that's very important, but it's also how to assess the light that you have and how to make
Yep.
choices about where you shoot things based on that assessment.
That's a very important insight. So very briefly, and by the way, a PDF with the slides and a PDF with written notes to go with each of the slides will be available as part of this package. So I don't want to go into too much detail here, but there are two primary light models that we use when we're talking about light. We often talk about the additive model. So I don't know if you've been to the Museum of Science, but they have this great exhibit where they show free projectors, blue, red, and green light, and where those three projected light beams intersect, you end up with white light, which I remember being around 5 years old and seeing this for the first time, and I just thought that was miraculous. Like, how can those three colors become white? Because my experience with paints was so different. But that's because my real world experience was the other lighting model, which we'll get to in a moment. But that was sort of magical, that you could combine these colors. It turns out if you combine red light and its complement cyan, you end up with white light as well. Because if you have equal amounts of red, green, and blue light, then we see what we call white. And so I would suggest visiting the PDF documents for the gory details. Now, when we're working with, often we want to change the color of a light source, and we'll put something called a gel over that light. And when we're doing that, we're using what we call the subtractive light model. In other words, we're filtering out some of the wavelengths and not others. So it turns out that if you put yellow, cyan, and magenta gels, which happen to be the complements of red, green, and blue, but if you put those three gels over a light table, for example, you will see that you end up with this muddy brown darkness where they overlap because you have pretty much filtered out all of the light sources. They're not perfect filters, so that black will never be totally black. This is why in like 4-color printing of like magazines and newspapers, they use cyan, magenta, yellow and black ink for that extra blackness. So that's also uses the subtractive system. So you can either use pigments or you can use gels to subtract particular wavelengths. So for example, if my scene was a little too orangey and I wanted my light sources to be a little less orangey, I would be putting different gradations of blue gels over those lights, for example. So that's the subtractive model. And it's, once you get to know this, it makes perfect sense. And we'll talk a little more about blue and orangey correction gels, which we have a tendency to use a lot in film video work because we're often correcting or changing the light from the cool blues to the warmer orangey lights. But that's the subtractive model at work. So it turns out that video cameras, being technical devices, they don't really know what white is. Some combination of red, green, and blue wavelengths is white, but your white might be different than my white, might be different than that Sony camera's white. So what we typically do when we white balance a camera is we point the camera and hold up a white card, and we push the white balance button, and we're telling the camera that particular combination of red, green, and blue, whatever it happens to be, that's my white reference. And now the camera will display whatever that card is as pure white. Well, it turns out that this sort of relative balance of red, green, and blue, the camera sees it as a technical problem to solve. And very often, the perfect white balance of a camera is often maybe a little too clean, too dry, too perfect. So a trick that I do is I get something called an 1/8 blue gel, which is like a pale, very pale blue gel. And when I white balance my camera, I hold that pale blue gel over the camera lens, I press the white balance button, and I push away the gel. And what have I done? I have fooled the camera into thinking that there's more blue in the world. And it compensates by making the image a teeny bit warmer, a little more orangey. And flesh tones look a lot better with just a little bit of warmth added. So this is sort of my little bit of basil in the sauce for a slightly tastier image. You will hear a lot of people talk about color temperature. This is a method that is used to describe what the color of a light source is. We work so often in this sort of orange to blue to white dimension simply because so many of our artificial and natural light sources are in that range. For example, fire, candle, matches, they're all kind of orange. Sunlight is very blue. And so it turns out that color temperature is basically what temperature do you need to heat up this theoretical black body radiator in order to get that color? Well, it turns out in practical everyday world, that black body radiator that you've read in cinematography books, the equivalent, think of it as a tungsten filament, as a light filament. The more juice you put through that filament, the less orangey it is and the more white it becomes. Of course, at some point it explodes because it's handling too much current. But in theory, if you heated it up to 9,000 degrees, you would have the same color as hazy sunlight, which is very, very pale blue, almost white. But if you bring the temperature down to 1,700 degrees Kelvin, you would have the nice orangey color of a match flame. So this is sort of this temperature scale from orangey on the low temperature end to like almost perfect white with a slight tinge of blue on the high end. There are two magic numbers that you hear in the world of white balance. 3,200 degrees Kelvin, which is the industry standard for tungsten filament incandescent lights. It is the standard that for almost 100 years, well, maybe 80 years, film emulsions were matched to that color temperature, so that something lit under 3,200 degree Kelvin light would look white. There's also daylight balanced film. So consumer film was usually balanced to 5,500 degrees Kelvin, and that's called daylight balance. So most electronic flash is balanced for daylight, and consumer film was always mostly balanced for daylight. And of course, now in the era of video and digital imaging, it's sort of kind of a little bit of a holdover, but we still use these terms because film lighting is still comes primarily in two flavors: tungsten balanced, quartz halogen lamps, LED lamps, fluorescent lamps, etc. They're all available matched perfectly 3200 degrees Kelvin, and a new generation of HMI daylight balance lights, daylight balanced fluorescence, daylight balanced LEDs. They're available matched perfectly to 5500 degrees Kelvin.
And also many cameras that you may use have preset white balance settings. So there may be one for daylight, there may be one for tungsten, and when you click it to one of those settings rather than create the white balance yourself, as David just described, essentially what you're doing is the equivalent of loading your camera with an emulsion that's balanced to one of those presets. So 3200 is in theory perfectly balanced for tungsten light, and the daylight balance is perfectly balanced in theory for about 5500, 5600 degrees
So
Kelvin.
yeah, and it's handy, right? When you buy lighting instruments, it's kind of nice that they all sort of match for the most part, right? Now, if we look at these three little pictures here, something to think about. Outdoor shadows are predominantly blue. Like if you shoot in shadow, you get really, really bluish images. To our eyes, it may look perfectly neutral, but to the camera, it looks really blue. Why? Because shadows doesn't have any direct sun. All the lighting in the shadow is coming from the sky, which is predominantly blue due to the way that the light waves are scattered. The different wavelengths are scattered a different amount, and so sky has a tendency to be very blue. In the middle picture, you see here a mixed environment. The interior lighting in this museum is tungsten incandescent lighting, but you have blue daylight streaming through the skylight. These are the most difficult situations to shoot because you basically have to split the difference or find some happy medium between the tungsten lighting and the daylight lighting, because there's no way to reproduce that the way the eye sees it unless you do some trickery in post-production. So often we're kind of splitting the difference between tungsten interior lighting and daylight streaming through windows. On a big Hollywood budget, you'd send a crew to maybe gel those windows and put orange gel over the windows so that now everything is perfectly balanced. As documentary makers, we typically don't have a crew that can gel windows and things like that, and so in some ways we have to be much more creative in terms of how we choose where we're going to set the white balance for our scene. And of course, sunsets are extremely warm due to the scattering, again, the way the light rays are scattered, and they have a tendency to be very, very warm, very, very orangey. And the more crap that we put in the atmosphere, the more gorgeous sunsets we get, which is the one thing I do miss about living in Los Angeles. We had intense, beautiful orange sunsets. So the smog is good for something. Let me relate this to the color correction that you're going to see in post. We talked about the green cyan dimension and the green magenta dimension and the blue yellow, which is the dimension that we're usually working with. And when you're correcting images in post-production, it turns out that the same dimensions that we saw in the additive color model come to work here as well, right? Because our LCD monitors, we're looking at red, green, and blue pixels. With our cameras, we have red, green, and blue sensitive sensors. So if our scene is a little too yellow or a little too blue, we can simply adjust in our color correction dial. So if you can correct in post-production these problems with white balance, why do we worry so much about it while we're shooting? The reason is you want to get the white balance right the first time when you shoot, because if the scene is excessively blue or the scene is excessively orange, what happens is you're going to overexpose the red channel or overexpose the blue channel. And what happens is once you overexpose that color channel, there's no information or detail to bring back when you correct. So you will always notice that a properly white balanced scene, you can fine-tune the color and get a very rich, sensual image. But if you shoot the wrong white balance and you go into correct, you're going to notice that your detail looks different and your highlights don't have the same texture and detail, because if you shot, for example, daylight balanced in a tungsten environment, you have completely whacked out the red channel relative to the green and blue channels, right? Mm-hmm. So you do want to get it right, because having one channel way overexposed, that detail is lost forever. So yes, you can correct in post, but get it right, get at least a good middle-of-the-road starting point in production. I want to revisit quality of light. So on the left, we have a scene that was shot on a cloudy day, and it's raining. And by the way, a little trick, on a cloudy day, you would never see the raindrops on film. So we cheated, and we put a very bright HMI backlight, daylight balanced backlight, behind the actors so that you would see the raindrops. So otherwise, the lighting is completely flat and diffused. But we cheated by having a little hard backlight that you don't actually see, and then the raindrops show up. But a typical overcast day has very, very soft light. The light is coming from many, many different directions, and so you don't see distinct shadows, and it has a particular maybe soft or maybe even a gloomy feel, depending on the context of the scene. Notice on the right, with direct sunlight, you get very, very hard, crisp, distinct shadows. So it turns out that what determines the quality of hard light versus soft light has a lot to do with the size of the light source. So even though the sun is many times larger than the Earth, because it's so far away, it's effectively a point source. And a teeny tiny point source is going to give us crisp, clean shadows. Whereas on an overcast day, the entire cloud cover is like Mother Nature's beautiful silk. It's all light coming from all sorts of different directions, and it's soft. And you can't beat the beautiful quality of light on a cloudy day, and then you can add a small accent light for a little bit of dimension, and you'll get beautiful video images. But harsh sunlight is pretty hard to deal with, especially with faces. But we'll talk about, when we do the hands-on demo, we'll talk about how we can deal with those issues in bright direct sunlight. So this is sort of a summary in more detail of what I've just talked about. But I want to point out that in terms of soft light sources, we're looking at things like soft boxes, which have a large diffusion material in front of a hard light, or light bouncing off of a white surface. This is how you create soft light, because you can't always order in a cloudy day, and cloudy days don't always walk into the building with you. So you may have to create that soft light with an artificial unit. Hard light, typically a direct sunlight, a Fresnel instrument, any kind of open face light with a reflector is going to give you hard light. What's nice, though, is you can always soften a hard light by throwing diffusion material in front of it, which spreads the beam. So it's always great to have hard lights in your kit, because you can always soften them. But once a soft light unit, there's really no practical way to make it hard again. Now, something that we are entering this world of 3D cinematography and all of that great stuff. But it turns out that for a zillion years, photographers, painters, cinematographers have been creating a sense of 3 dimensions without 2 cameras and 2 lenses, but using light to do it. And the trick is to create these alternating areas of light and dark in a scene. And the great prince of chiaroscuro was Caravaggio. Caravaggio basically introduced black into the painter's palette and created these really dramatic 3-dimensional effects by alternating light and dark and light and dark. And we often talk about Rembrandt lighting in portraiture, and that little trademark, little triangle in the cheek opposite the light source is one of the trademarks of Rembrandt lighting. And it's not really about the triangle, but what the triangle means is that, once again, we've created this sense of light on the side of the face, and then darkness behind the nose, and then another area of light, and then another area of darkness. And those sort of alternating areas of light and dark create this sense of dimension. So by simply moving the direction and the quality of your primary light source, you can go from flat daytime soap opera lighting to dimensional, dramatic, frontline interview or Rembrandt portrait kind of lighting. And it's all about the quality of light and what direction it's coming from. And Rembrandt and Caravaggio offer a wonderful study in classic chiaroscuro lighting. So let's talk about a few practical, real-world, almost run and gun, but not quite, carrying 3 lights sort of interviews. So here's a frame from a film. The lighting is a little more dramatic than you usually see. I have a tendency to err on the side of drama. We sort of have that little Rembrandt triangle on her cheek, and we can see that there's alternating areas of light, dark, in this frame. So how did we create this? What did we do? So if we look behind the scenes, we see that we have a primary light source, a soft box. The primary light source is typically called the key light, our primary light source. It's off to the side. It's creating that sense of dimension. To the right, we have what's called the fill light. Whatever light is filling in the shadows created by the key light, we call that the fill light. And in the case of this example, we're using a reflector. It's called a flex fill, which you'll see in the live demo portion of our show. We're using a flex fill to reflect some of that key light back onto the subject so that the dark side of the face doesn't become totally dark. And then slightly off the top of the frame there, we have a backlight. And we're using the backlight to create a little bit, if we go back to this image, there's a little bit of light on her shoulder, and there's a little bit of light on her hair that's coming from behind her. So what we did is we have a 300-watt Fresnel. We'll talk a little more about Fresnels later. Behind her that's just giving a little bit of light coming from the back, which creates a little bit of additional dimensionality and separation from the background. But in this particular frame, it's very subtle. If you overdo the backlight, all of a sudden things start to look theatrical. We're in the middle of a play. We're not in the middle of a documentary anymore. So you have to be careful because the backlight is a very artificial element. But if done subtly, it can look very much like a natural element and give a little bit of separation, and we can see a little bit of shine in the hair. And then we have a fourth light, because remember, we've got the key light, the fill light, filling in the shadows caused by the key light, a backlight coming from behind the subject, offering a little bit of dimension, and there's a fourth light that we often talk about, and that's the background light, not to be confused with the backlight. Now, the background light in this particular scene is being provided by the window in the upper right-hand corner. I've covered up part of the window with foam core, but I've left the rest of the window open to kind of add this sort of overall light. So if we go back here, the overall ambient light that's lighting the back wall is a mixture of what's coming in from the window and what's coming in from the key light, because we don't want the background. We want the background to be a little bit darker than the subject, so the subject kind of pops out as the main element, because one of the things that we're thinking about when we're lighting is we're drawing attention. We're using lighting to draw the viewer's attention to what the important things are in the frame. But we don't want to completely obscure the background, because while the interview subject may be the subject of our image, there's also a predicate, just like any good sentence. And so the context here is the editing room, is the equipment that's in the room. So we want to feature that too, but we want it to feel like it's part of the background, both in terms of intensity and in terms of placement. So a little bit of background light is being provided by both spill from the key as well as some of the windows. So what we did is we varied that foam core until we had just the right amount of ambient light in the room, and that's where we placed it. So very often you can use natural light as one of your light units. I like to work with what's natural. I knew that was facing in a direction that we wouldn't have direct sun shining in the room anytime during the interview, so it's always good to know what direction the sun's going in. So we could rely for 2 hours that we would have skylight but no direct sunlight to kind of mess up our scene. So if I can bring Mother Nature into the lighting equation, that's great. If I could do this whole setup without any artificial light, that would be even better. But that doesn't always work out that way. So I'm going to basically kind of review what we just talked about in 4 different environments. So a typical formal interview is what you just saw. In this particular situation, I saw that there were these beautiful French doors in the room. I said, aha, we're going to use that as our background because it kind of, it looks nice. It adds a little bit of dimension. But I want the background to recede, and I want the foreground to move forward. Well, it turns out that your warmer colors have a tendency to move forward, and your cooler colors, like your blues, have a tendency to kind of fall into the background. So what did I do is I put a background light behind the lace curtains, behind those French doors, with a half blue gel. So that's giving me the kind of the bluish background. And of course, she's being lit by a softbox, something called a Rifa light from Lowell. So the primary key in this case is a soft, relatively medium-sized, I guess, soft light. And once again, we're using the reflector flex fill as our fill light because, the less wires and the less light that I can travel with, the better. So we basically lit this situation with 2 lights plus the ambient spill that was coming from the windows in the middle of the day. So this was, once again, a 3-point lighting setup, but we're only using 2 fixtures because we're making use of the natural light that was available in this living room at the time. And the key is relatively soft, and you can tell that by the way the light wraps around the face. So notice how, even though that there's a shadow where her nose is, and there's a shadow on the right-hand side of her face, there is a smooth gradient from the light to the dark area, and we call that the way the light wraps around the face. If we had we'll see now in this other interview, we have a harsh overhead standard Edison-based light bulb, 150-watt screw-in light bulb in the top of the room. There's also a couple of small quartz lights that are lighting the toy collection cabinet behind her. But this is basically working under very harsh, non-optimal lighting conditions. And so it's not at all flattering. In some ways, we're not doing our subject justice. Of course, in this film, she was sort of playfully playing the role of the bad guy. So the lighting kind of worked dramatically for those purposes. So I decided to go with it rather than bringing the lighting kit out because we said it looks okay. We want this to kind of be raw and harsh. Once again, it's all about context. What does the lighting do for your storytelling? It was okay for a character making certain harsh comments to be kind of in slightly harsh light. At least it worked for me creatively in this particular scene. But most of the time, that's not what I want. Here's another situation which is not at all optimal. This is handheld, impromptu conversation with a character in the middle of an art opening. The lighting was mixed, window light, dark corners, incandescent lights, harsh, really, really difficult. I looked around the room and I go, oh my God, what are we going to do? And then I saw this big window and I said, do you mind standing next to the big window? So out of the darkness, I was able to move the subject so that she was being lit by window light. So here's me, no lights, no kit, camera in my right hand, microphone in the left hand. Let's move by the window. So sometimes you just got to look around and see where the light looks best and move your subject into that area.
And it's remembering, again, to apply some of the principles that you're talking about in a situation where you don't have lights, but still keeping in mind all of the things that we're discussing. The intensity of the light, the direction of the light, the quality of the light, the color of the light, and making choices on where you conduct your interviews or do your shooting.
Exactly.
Based on those principles.
In fact, in this case, I didn't even have time to do my 8th blue trick. I just set the preset to daylight because I knew that the window was pretty much daylight. And of course, you're getting the little bit of triangle on the cheek because of her position relative to the light. So that is what I'm always paying attention to. I watch somebody talking and I go, am I seeing that dimensional light? Sometimes I just, and in fact, when I'm doing an impromptu interview like this, I won't ask the subject to change. Very often, I will move and watch how the lighting changes on their face. because sometimes just moving to the left a foot and a half or to the right a foot and a half will completely change the lighting when somebody moves their face like this to look at you or like this to look at you. So those are the things that you want to get in the habit of, like, always thinking about. It becomes this automatic background process, sort of like, background rendering or whatever. And of course, I do like dramatic chiaroscuro sometimes. This was a particular moment where the character is talking about how he first came to Boston and he found it to be a cool and uninviting place and people weren't very friendly. And so even though most of the interviews in this film are shot in natural light, I decided to shoot this one kind of dramatic and dark. This is sort of this is where the character starts to realize certain things, and it's a very sort of kind of personal, intimate moment. So we said, okay, let's kind of do the more chiaroscuro thing. So you have the light coming from the side, and we're using actually pretty relatively intense blue backlights for the background, so that the background doesn't go totally black, but it's relatively dark. So this is a little more along the lines of Caravaggio versus Vermeer.
And you can also see kind of the theatricality that you were talking about
Yes.
before.
And this is
I mean, it
kind of
might work for
theatrical.
the subject in this case.
Right, it
but-
worked in this case.
Yeah.
And it's really the only interview in the entire film that's lit this way. It was kind of a brief theatrical moment in some respects. But yeah, it has that theatricality. It's not at all natural. Right? This was of somebody feeling like a fish out of water. I wanted to create an image that didn't feel like it fit with the rest of the film. So these are 4 different approaches to an interview situation. And if you take a look at the PDF, I've kind of synthesized what I have found from 7 or 8 different sources. There are basically, as you change the key light, as you change the position of the key light relative to the subject, you go from this continuum from glamour lighting on the left, where the key light and the fill light are actually directly overhead. There's a small little butterfly shadow under the nose, and there's a fill light filling that in so it's not a harsh shadow under the nose. And this kind of Hollywood lighting where the key is almost in front of the subject gives you this very glamorous look, especially if you have high cheekbones. But it's not at all natural, but it is very glamorous. And then as you move the fill light to the left, in the middle here, you get to the Rembrandt style, which is kind of my tendency. I like the light coming from the left. I also find in situations where I'm like using a small handheld LED light to give a little bit of supplemental lighting in a otherwise verite situation, if I put the light to the left of the subject, not only do they look better and more dimensional, but it's not glaring in their eye. And that's actually more comfortable. And then, of course, profile lighting, where you basically, the key is behind the subject. And you're emphasizing their profile. I mean, that's really dramatic. You would do that for sort of, interview with somebody whose identity you want to obscure. You kill the fill light, and you have a backlight coming from the back, and you just see this outline rim of a person. So as what this slide is about is to encourage you. When I've taught a detailed cinematography class, I actually have the students set all of these up and shoot all these different setups and reflect on how the lighting changes as you move the key light around. It'd be cool to have like a 3D simulator environment to kind of try these things out. But there's nothing like going out into the real world with your lighting kit and trying these different setups. So we've talked about soft light. We've talked about hard lights. Some common lights that you find available in the market today. There's a variety of soft lights. They're very popular, since if you're going to do a simple, quick and dirty interview with a single light, typically you'll just pull out a soft light. A popular soft light is something called the Lowell Rifa. It kind of pops open like an umbrella. You throw a diffuser on the front, you hook it up to the stand, and it sets up very quickly, an instant soft light. I prefer, although they're a little more expensive, I love the Kino Flow Diva light. This is a fluorescent light fixture that has 4 or 2, depending on the size, fluorescent bulbs, and you can pop in either daylight balanced fluorescence or tungsten balanced fluorescence. I've done a lot of interviews outdoors, under a tree, in the shade, and brought in the Diva with the daylight balanced light just for a little bit of sparkle in the eyes, just for a little bit of extra definition. And all of a sudden it takes something in the shade and soft and gives it just a little bit of dimensionality. And you can't do that unless your light source is daylight balanced. And the Diva is just barely bright enough to use in the shade. No light source is going to work in the sun unless you have a Hollywood grip truck. But for indoor interviews, the Diva, a couple of Divas is just spectacular in terms of soft light with just a little bit of directionality, and the fact that you can pop in and out the fluorescent light tubes for either daylight or tungsten is really awesome. It comes in a little suitcase with both sets of bulbs, and off you go. Open face lights are much less expensive. They're relatively cheap. Anything from a $30 work light at Home Depot to a Lowell Omni light. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Typically, they have a parabolic reflector. And then we'll talk in a moment about fresnels. Fresnels are a little fancier. They actually have a lens system. PARs, and of course, what you see here in the picture is a PAR with a softbox on top of it. PARs are very efficient light sources because they have this parabolic reflector built into the light unit, and they're often available in this high technology daylight balanced light called an HMI. Small PARs in the 300 watt range are very popular with documentary crews because you can power them off a small battery. They're daylight balanced, so you can use them outdoors to get rid of shadows and stuff like that. And then if you need to soften them, you can always pop a softbox in the front, or if you need that hard intensity, efficiency of the PAR unit, you can just pull the softbox off. So they're very versatile in that respect. And in fact, here in Boston, the local rental house rents something called the Cobalt. Did I say that right? Cobalt small HMI PAR, which is really useful. But if you're on a tight budget, you don't necessarily have to go out and spend thousands of dollars on professional lighting. Mother Nature usually provides her services for free. You can use practical household bulbs. Popular among some folks are simple photo flood lamps, which are very bright incandescent lamps that you can put in inexpensive fixtures. It turns out fluorescent utility lights, ordinary fluorescent lights, you can actually go to your local hardware supply store and buy daylight balanced or tungsten balanced fluorescent tubes. Chroma 50s and Ultra 32s, I think they're called. And you can put them in ordinary fluorescent fixtures. Chinese lanterns are awesome, these paper little lanterns, but I wouldn't use more than a 60 or pushing it 100 watt bulb in these paper lanterns and never leave them unattended. Regardless of how flame retardant the manufacturers say they are, I wouldn't leave them alone. But they give you this beautiful soft light. Now there's a professional version of these lanterns called Chimera lanterns, and they're made of a special high heat resistant material, and you can put a pretty powerful 1,000 watt lamp inside one of those and get this beautiful, beautiful soft light. But I've seen a lot of people get a lot of mileage out of ordinary work lights. I know a lot of animation folks use ordinary hardware store work lights for their lighting source. You can clip a little diffusion in the front if you need to. They're cheap. The only downside is that they don't fold up nicely for travel. But if you're doing like animation work at home, those inexpensive work lights work great, and you can actually buy tungsten balanced 3200 degree Kelvin bulbs for them. So on-camera lights, some people like them. I personally don't like on-camera lights because I really don't like the flat look that they create. I prefer to hold a camera off to the side, find an assistant, find somebody to kind of hold the light off to the side. I've even done it myself. Your arm gets really, really, really tired, but it pays off by not having that deer caught in the headlights look of the light directly on the camera. People don't like being blinded. Get the light off to the side is the moral of the story. But these small battery-powered lights, especially the new generation of light-emitting diode LED lights, are spectacular because I've been able to like shoot all day with like 4 camera batteries and a couple of LED lights. Not on continuously, but it can work. I have a thing for fresnels. I really like the quality of their light. They were originally developed by Augustin Fresnel, who contributed to the theory of color and optics, and the French Lighthouse Commission had a problem, you know, in the early 1800s. Those whale oil lamps weren't very bright. Ships are going into rocks. A lot of sailors and merchandise was being lost at sea. And they commissioned Fresnel to solve the lighthouse problem. Well, he realized, you know what? If we put a whole bunch of these triangular pieces of glass in the right arrangement, we can take all of those light rays that are going astray and send them all off single line out to sea. And all of a sudden, these teeny tiny little whale oil powered lamps were super bright because all of the light rays are going single file where they're supposed to be, out to sea, instead of, you know, lighting the side of the lighthouse. Who cares about that, right? So what's interesting about Fresnels is that they're very crisp, clean, focused lights that cast perfectly clean shadows. They have the same quality of light as direct sunlight. They're great for backlights. They're great for when you want that sort of quality of light coming through a window. They're a little heavier and more expensive because they have this scalloped glass lens, which you might recognize the pattern from lighthouses, which we have a lot of here in New England. And so the units are a little heavier, but they have a little knob where you can focus them, and they have that nice, crisp quality of light. So I have a thing for Fresnels. I really like them. I own 5 myself. But they are heavy to carry around. That's the price you pay. They are physically bigger and physically heavier. Here's a chart sort of comparing different lighting technologies, because not only do we have different configuration of lights like open face, soft light, open face Fresnel, soft light, etc., in terms of the physical configuration of the light source versus, you know, the lens unit and things like that. But there's basically 4 technologies that we use today in professional lighting for providing the source of light. Typical tungsten incandescent lamps are the least expensive, but they use up a lot of energy. Unfortunately, incandescent lights, they're actually space heaters that happen to give a small percentage of their energy out in the light range. But they're, you know, maybe 30% is light and the rest of the energy is heat. They're very hot. And on a hot summer day, they're just really uncomfortable to be close to. HMIs is newer technology, daylight balanced, very high tech units, but they're expensive. They require a lot of electronics. They require very sophisticated lamps with rare earth gases and all kinds of fancy stuff, but they're daylight balanced and they're very bright and very efficient. Kind of halfway in between are fluorescents. They make great soft lights. They run very cool. They're not necessarily the best thing for the environment, but neither are the other lighting sources. But they run cool and they use less power, and the KinoFlow fluorescent lights are just awesome. And up and coming are LEDs. LEDs have come a long way in the last few years. They're available in these like panels of either daylight balanced or tungsten balanced. In fact, Light Panels has a really nice grid. That's a bicolor panel. It's a grid of both daylight and tungsten balanced LEDs, and you can dial in how much you want of each. There's also a small version called the Blender, which actually has a grid of LED of daylight and tungsten balanced LEDs, and you can dial in the color temperature you want. So they're very expensive compared to other light sources, but they're very versatile. The Xylight is a model of LED light that you can dial in any color because it uses a red, green, blue grid of LEDs. There's some really nice new products in the LED department, and while they're expensive, their lightness is just awesome. You can pretty much, if you go all LEDs, you can cut the weight and size of your lighting kit in half. So there's something to be said for high tech. If you're just starting out, you don't have any lighting at all, and you'd like a little something to start with, one suggestion is an open face light with an umbrella. Lowell makes this light called the Tota light, and they also have a newer version called the V-Light, which is a little safer. But this is basically just an open face light unit, and used with an umbrella bouncing the light, you can now have a choice between a hard light or a soft light. And so you can get a very quick and easy, lightweight, soft source by bouncing the toda off the umbrella, and there's your soft light. And you can put this kit together, including a small light stand for less than $250 from your favorite online equipment retailer or your local photo shop that sells video and lighting equipment. So this is the Lowell Toda Light or the Lowell V-Light as a great starter kit. You can put this in a teeny duffel bag. I've often taken something like this with me on the train down to New York. Camera on one shoulder with sound gear and this on the other shoulder. Very light, simple, effective. Then, over time, you might want to add, additional units depending on your particular lighting style. A lot of people ask me, what lighting kit do you recommend? Well, it's really hard for me to recommend a lighting kit because it really depends on what your preferences are and what you want to accomplish. So I would suggest, buy one light at a time, learn it, get to know it, and figure out what you want next. Start with a basic soft light and go from there. You might want to add some fresnels. You might want to add some LED lights. You might want to add a flex fill reflector, which you'll see in the live demo portion. So these are various things that you might want to add, but explore, use it, and figure out what you need. A lot of towns have rental houses that you can rent light kits. Rent a kit for a weekend, get to know it, decide what you like, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. Just remember, it all starts with a good key light. So definitely, at some point, you want to have something like a Lowell Rifa light or a KinoFlow Diva light as your staple soft light. And then we talked about diffusion material, that you can get this. It sort of looks like opaque kind of gel that will soften any light. That's why it's nice to have a few hard lights, because you can always soften them with gels. Color changing gels, there's this whole series called CTB for color temperature blue, CTO for color temperature orange. You can use these gels for changing the color of light sources. Black wrap is an interesting material. It's aluminum foil with flame retardant black paint. You can use that if light is spilling from a light unit, you use the black wrap to kind of kill the spill off the light, and you won't start any fires because it's flame retardant and it's metal foil. It does get hot though. And several manufacturers make these great little wrapping things called jelly rolls that you can roll up your gels in, and they come in both small and large sizes. Dimmers are handy for dimming lights, but I'll warn you now that they create 60-cycle hum and buzz, and very often the filament of lights will buzz. So if you carry dimmers on the set, if you're working with a sound person, they will talk to you about it. So dimmers are useful, but they're tricky because of the interference problems. But they can, in some cases, they can be used. Cube taps are useful for turning one outlet into three. Want to be careful with those 2-prong to 3-prong adapters, but in a lot of older houses, they don't have 3-prong plugs, my own included. Gloves are handy if you I usually handle lights without gloves because I know exactly where the hot parts are and where the hot parts aren't from years of experience. But when you're starting out, you might want to use gloves and be careful. Gaffer tape will solve any problem that the lighting instruments can't solve in most cases. And I won't go into detail, but as you expand your lighting work, you might want to add things like flags and nets for sculpting light, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. If you ever have larger lights, you're going to need to put sandbags on the stands. So having some portable beach is very, very handy. And there's the universal C-stand that's can be used for all sorts of things, hanging sound blankets in addition to holding lights and stuff. And there's a lot of gripology that we're not going to get into today, but it's good to know that there is this whole collection of gear out there. But some that are useful is if you're working in an environment with drop ceilings, These little scissor clamps are great, which will give you a standard 5/8 inch stud for hanging a small light. It's good to have a couple of those in your kit. Mayfer clamps are very handy, also known as photo clamps, depending on who you ask. These are great clamps that you can attach to pipes and all sorts of conduit and things if you need. You'll notice that for all small lights, the industry standard is a 5/8 inch stud. It's also known as a baby stud. Grip clips are great. You can buy official grip clips. You can go to the hardware store and buy the equivalent for a fraction of the price. I still use a light meter sometimes when I'm setting up lights, but it's probably an anachronism. Though it is handy to have an 18% gray card. White on one side for white balance, gray on the other side. Very often if you're color correcting a scene and you put that gray card in the scene and now you have a gray reference. So if you're color obsessed like myself, you might want to carry a gray card in your kit. But, and there's a list here of other things. This is sort of a homework assignment. Figure out what all these things are. It's a good thing to learn. You know, at the end of the day, just remember there are no rules about what is good lighting and bad lighting. Because one person's bad lighting is another person's dramatic lighting. It might be bad if it creates the wrong ambience for the scene, or produces an unintended unflattering effect, or it distracts the viewer's attention. Remember, we were talking about we use light to drive the viewer's attention in the scene. But if it's not doing that, then maybe it is bad lighting. Does it prevent the viewer from seeing what's important? Or is it showing things that are irrelevant? So one of the biggest problems with point-and-shoot video is that oftentimes our subject is obscured and something that's completely unimportant is staring us right at the face. So think about what is it doing for you and your own storytelling. Good lighting allows us to do many, many things. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but once again, it can help us draw attention to what's important in the scene. It can help isolate the subject. It could imply a season. It could establish a locale. It can concentrate attention to a particular part of the scene. It can emphasize form, like we talked about with chiaroscuro, or we can de-emphasize form with flat lighting. At the end of the day, it's about altering the viewer's emotional response and establishing a mood. And so here's kind of my laundry list of all the things that lighting can do for you. And through experience and through practice, you will see how what you do with lighting has an impact in your storytelling. So that's kind of a list of all the things that lighting can do for you. And at the end here, there's a brief glossary of terms of enlightenment, which is a word I borrowed from Ross Lowell, who wrote a wonderful book called Matters of Light and Depth, which I highly recommend. There's electricity involved in lighting, and you want to be very careful and treat it with respect. And if you have frayed wires or anything damaged in your lighting equipment, you want to fix it before you plug it into the wall. What you have here is a simple calculator for determining, do you have enough power to provide the power for your lighting units? So the way to remember it is a 20 amp circuit, a 20 amp household circuit, which is pretty standard in bathrooms and kitchens, in contemporary construction. In a lot of older houses, you will find 15 amp circuits. But the thing to remember, a 20 amp circuit can support 2,000 watts. That's the only number you need to remember. And you can extrapolate from there. A 20 amp circuit can feed 2,000 watts. Because you just basically take the amps and multiply by 100, right? Amps are basically a measure of how much current, how much oomph you're drawing from that circuit. And the wattage of a lamp, 2,000 watts, 100 watts, is how much energy that lamp is putting to work. So the important thing is that you don't want to draw more current from the circuit than it can take, because then you'll pop the circuit breaker. So whenever you set up a lighting kit, if your total lighting kit only uses 1,500 watts, you probably don't have to worry about popping an ordinary breaker. But you want to know where the breaker box is just in case. And whenever I go into somebody's home to do an interview or whatever, I always ask them, do you have anything plugged in that if the power went out would cause some sort of disaster? Always ask. There are times, for example, when I've run extension cords into a kitchen to power an interview in a living room because somebody had their computer set up and they didn't want to turn it off and whatever, you just don't want to mess with it. But the thing is, you can, in modern construction, you can always count on a solid 20 amp circuit in a kitchen or a bathroom. And usually there's nothing else plugged into that circuit. So this will go into some safety tips, common sense that you should read. And I mentioned a good resource for further study is Ross Lowell's wonderful book, Matters of Light and Depth. To date, it's the best book ever written about lighting. It's written from the point of view of a lot of experience. And what's interesting about Ross Lowell is he has done a lot of shooting with a minimal amount of gear. And it's written from the point of view of getting the most out of the least amount of gear in terms of lighting. And Ross Lowell developed a company, Lowell Lights, to sell his, at the time, he developed a whole new generation of lightweight lighting units, which were very popular among documentarians who didn't want to carry around big equipment cases. They wanted to carry around small equipment cases. And it's also written with a wonderful sense of humor. You will chuckle while you read this book. So Matters of Life and Death, highly recommended. And there's also a lot of wonderful resources online. dvinfo.net is a wonderful discussion group for matters of a technical nature. And selfreliantfilm.com is a wonderful blog about making films do-it-yourself style, which I highly recommend. And that's it.
So just to wrap up, the second half after a short break is going to be the demo, and a lot of the things that David talked about and showed in the PowerPoint will become a little bit clearer as we go through the demo. But just to sort of wrap up, a lot of lighting, especially lighting on our level, beginning and sort of low, no instrument lighting, boils down to just learning how to see things. And it's so much like other things in shooting, framing, learning how to shoot for an edit. You really need to practice seeing what's actually there and thinking about how that is going to affect your audience. You know, you're the first audience for your film. So all of the things that David talked about at the end really boil down to seeing what's there and learning how to make a determination about what needs to be changed in order to get the image that's going to have the impact that it needs to have. So often, and I think I've said this before, but so often, even people who have been doing film for a long time sometimes fall into the trap of forgetting that you can actually make a change because it's difficult or it's in position, it's problematic for somebody. But if it really is necessary to make some kind of change, it's really up to you to do it. So if you're shooting in a room, doing an interview in a room or in a location that's not going to work because the lighting just is impossible to do, if the person's standing in a place that it's just going to be a disaster, you need to make a change. You need to ask them to move somewhere else. And determining, using your experience and your sensitivity to what the situation is based on some of these things David's talked about, these basic principles, then determines where you get them to move to, what change you actually affect in order to get the image that you need to get. So that's it. I think the second part of this is going to be really fun because we're going to see some of these principles in action. So thanks a lot.